Quartal chords are chords that are derived from a stack of fourths rather than the traditional stack of thirds. If you know little or nothing about them, first watch my video linked below explaining what they are. So here we have a typical quartal chord. We already know that the Q stands for quartal, so now let's see what this text and this number in the label mean. Standard chords built on thirds are typically labeled by their highest extension. Chord extensions are derived by building thirds on top of the seventh of the chord, getting you the possible intervals of 9, 11, and 13. If you were to add one more, you would get 15, which is the double octave. We can stay consistent with the standard system of labeling chords by tweaking it to fit with quartal chords. Instead of stacking thirds on top of the seventh, we will stack fourths. This will get us the possible intervals of 10, 13, 16, and 19. The next number would be 22, which is the triple octave. It is important to note that just like with chords based on thirds, the chord is labeled not by the highest note, but by the highest note in its origin voicing as a stack of fourths. By the way, you could technically have a two-note quartal chord, which would be labeled by a Q followed by no number. So far, all these quartal chords have been made up of only perfect fourths, but what about quartal chords with augmented fourths? An augmented fourth can exist between any two notes in the quartal chord. The presence and location of this augmented fourth determines the quality of the chord. We can use modes to describe the quality of any quartal chord. Each possible quartal chord corresponds to a mode based on the chord's root note. We have Locrian, Phrygian, Aeolian, Dorian, Mixolydian, Ionian, and Lydian. Each mode is abbreviated for in the label of the chord. Notice how a 7-note quartal chord with only perfect fourths corresponds to the Locrian mode. Since perfect fourths are the default, it is redundant to label such chords as Locrian, so we can just call this a BQ19 chord instead. Each chord quality has a minimum required chord size. You can't have a Phrygian 7, 10, 13, or even 16 chord, since the augmented fourth of such a chord would have to be between the 16th and 19th. On the other hand, you can have an Ionian quartal chord with just 3 notes. Now what if there are two augmented fourths in the chord? Two augmented fourths stacked on top of each other form an augmented seventh. This interval is enharmonic to the octave. Therefore, if you add a second augmented fourth to a quartal chord, you will not add a new note to the chord. Instead, you'll simply double a pre-existing note up the octave. Now what if there's a diminished fourth? It is debatable if a chord with a diminished fourth should be considered a quartal chord. This is because the diminished fourth is enharmonic to the major third. This is the famous mystic chord from the music of Alexander Scriabin. A chord such as the mystic chord could simply be labeled as a regular chord, in this case as a C13 sharp 11 chord. Instead of being a quartal chord, it would be called a quartal voicing. This is a term used to describe chord voicings that use a lot of fourths. However, if you were to insist that this is a quartal chord despite the diminished fourth, you can still name it the same way as with the other chords, with a mode. However, it would require a non-diatonic mode. For example, this mystic chord would be a C quartal Lydian dominant 16 chord, named after the Lydian dominant mode. Now let's look at the labeling of another famous quartal chord. These two same chords are the So What chord made famous by Miles Davis. This chord is typically thought of as a quartal voicing of a minor 11 chord. However, since modal jazz exists in a space between the tonal and non-tonal, one could think of these chords as true quartal chords instead. If you revoice the chords into their origin voicing, you can clearly see that they could be a BQ13 and an AQ13 chord. Just like with tertian chords, you can use slash notation to label chord inversions, or in other words, chords that don't have their root in the bass. In such a case, the note written after the slash denotes the bass note. Now you know how to build every and any quartal chord and how to label it. To support this channel, you can like, subscribe, listen to my music, or donate below. Thank you.